Imagine a fog-shrouded morning in ancient Greece where two armies stumble into each other completely by accident. On one side stands the proud heir of Alexander the Great, King Philip V of Macedon, commanding the legendary Phalanx, a wall of 18-foot pikes that had once conquered the known world. On the other side, the disciplined legions of Rome, a rising superpower that has never faced this Macedonian war machine in a pitched battle. This isn't a carefully planned engagement. This is a brutal, chaotic collision born from pure chance, where the fate of Greece and the balance of power in the ancient Mediterranean world will be decided in a single, desperate morning. Welcome to Cynoscephalae, the day Rome proved that the age of the Phalanx was over and a new era of warfare had begun. Before we dive into this game-changing battle that would reshape the ancient world, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss the incredible military stories we have coming up. Now let's witness how terrain, flexibility, and split-second decisions turned an accidental encounter into one of history's most decisive battles. The year was 197 BC, and the Mediterranean world was trembling on the edge of a historic transformation. For over a century and a half since the death of Alexander the Great, the Macedonian kingdom had been one of the great powers of the Hellenistic world, its military reputation built on the fearsome phalanx that had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. But now, a new power was rising in the west, one that had already humbled the mighty Carthage and was casting its hungry gaze eastward. Rome had arrived in Greece, and the ancient order was about to be shattered forever. The Second Macedonian War had been raging for 3 brutal years, though its roots stretched back even further into the complex web of Mediterranean politics. Philip V of Macedon, a king of considerable ambition and talent, had made what would prove to be the most catastrophic mistake of his reign during the darkest days of Rome's struggle with Carthage. In 215 BC, while Rome was reeling from Hannibal's devastating victories in Italy, Philip had seen an opportunity too tempting to resist. He formed an alliance with Carthage, Rome's mortal enemy, hoping to exploit Roman weakness and expand Macedonian influence across the Adriatic Sea into the rich territories of Illyria. The alliance had seemed brilliant at the time. Rome was on its knees, its army shattered, its Italian allies deserting, and Hannibal seemed unstoppable. Philip calculated that a weakened Rome could not possibly fight a two-front war. He was wrong. The First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BC, that followed, was a frustrating, indecisive affair that ended with the Peace of Phenice. But Rome had never forgotten Philip's betrayal. The Romans had memories like elephants and grudges like vengeful gods. They were simply waiting for the right moment to settle accounts. That moment came after Rome finally crushed Carthage in the Second Punic War. With Hannibal defeated and their position in the western Mediterranean secure, the Roman Senate turned its attention eastward with cold determination. Philip, meanwhile, had been busy. He had not learned his lesson about Roman resolve. Instead, he had formed a secret pact with the Seleucid king Antiochus III to carve up the territories of the weakening Ptolemaic Egypt. His aggressive expansion brought him into conflict with the Greek city-states of Rhodes and Pergamon, both of which sent desperate embassies to Rome pleading for intervention. The Romans, who had been looking for an excuse, found it. Philip's harassment of these Greek cities, combined with intelligence about his pact with Antiochus, convinced the Senate that Macedon needed to be dealt with decisively. In 200 BC, Rome declared the Second Macedonian War, claiming they were fighting to liberate the Greek cities from Macedonian tyranny. It was brilliant propaganda. the Romans positioned themselves as liberators, defenders of Greek freedom against the oppressive Macedonian king. The irony that Rome would eventually dominate Greece far more thoroughly than Macedon ever did was lost on no one who lived to see it. Philip responded to this Roman declaration with a fury born of desperation and wounded pride. He descended upon Athens with a vengeance in 200 BC, leading 5,000 infantry and 300 cavalry in a lightning raid. The Athenians, who had unwisely declared war on Macedon at the urging of King Attalus of Pergamon, watched in horror as Philip's forces defeated their army outside the Dipylon Gate. But Philip's revenge went beyond mere military victory. In an act of cultural vandalism that shocked the Hellenic world, he ravaged the sanctuaries and tombs throughout Attica, systematically destroying the rural shrines that had stood for centuries. The damage was so severe that many of these sacred sites would never be used again. It was a message written in fire and desecration: defy Macedon at your peril. Throughout 199 and 198 BC, the war ground on with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Philip was a capable general who used the mountainous terrain of Greece to his advantage, making it difficult for the Romans to bring him to battle on their terms. He fortified key positions, garrisoned strategic cities including the fetters of Greece, Demetrius, Chalcis, and Corinth, and used his superior knowledge of the local geography to frustrate Roman advances. The Roman commander initially assigned to the war struggled to make progress against these tactics. But in 198 BC, everything changed. Rome sent a new commander to Greece, a young, brilliant, and ambitious consul named Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Around 30 years old, Flamininus was a remarkable figure who combined military genius with diplomatic skill and a genuine appreciation for Greek culture that was unusual among Romans of his time. He spoke fluent Greek, understood Hellenic philosophy, and could quote Homer. But beneath this cultured exterior was a warrior of steel who had learned his trade fighting Hannibal in the brutal campaigns of southern Italy. He was the perfect weapon to deploy against Philip, a commander who could out-general him on the battlefield and outmaneuver him in the complex world of Greek politics. Flamininus immediately changed the dynamics of the war. He understood that to defeat Philip he needed to isolate him politically before destroying him militarily. He skillfully negotiated with the Greek leagues, particularly the influential Aetolian League, bringing them over to the Roman side with promises of freedom and autonomy. He offered Philip seemingly reasonable peace terms that were designed to be unacceptable, demanding withdrawal from all of Greece, including Thessaly, which had been part of the Macedonian kingdom for over 150 years. When Philip predictably refused, Flamininus had his justification for total war. Flamininus also proved his military credentials in the field. At the Battle of the Ouse River in 198 BC, he faced Philip's forces dug into a seemingly impregnable position in a narrow mountain gorge. Rather than launch a costly frontal assault, Flamininus used intelligence from a local shepherd to find a hidden path around the Macedonian position. He sent a force to attack Philip's unsuspecting flank, forcing the Macedonian king into a chaotic and humiliating retreat. It was a preview of the tactical flexibility that would soon prove decisive. As 197 BC dawned, both commanders knew that a final confrontation was inevitable. Philip had mobilized every available resource of his kingdom, scraping together an army of approximately 25,000 men. The core of this force was his 16,000-strong phalanx, the legendary Macedonian heavy infantry, armed with the fearsome sarissa, an 18-foot pike. To this he added 2,000 peltasts, light infantry from Thrace and Illyria, and critically, 2,500 hardened mercenaries who brought experience and a professionalism that could steady the line. His cavalry, about 2,000 strong, included both Macedonians and Thessalians, the finest horsemen in Greece. The phalanx was Philip's trump card, the weapon that had made his ancestor Alexander the Great master of the known world. When properly deployed on flat, open ground, it was virtually unstoppable. The phalangites, as these specialized infantry were called, fought in a formation typically 16 men deep. The front 5 ranks would level their 18-foot sarissas forward, creating an impenetrable forest of steel pike points. Behind them, the rear ranks would hold their pikes, vertically, ready to step forward as casualties mounted in the front ranks. When the phalanx advanced, it was like watching a moving fortress of bronze and iron, a grinding wall of death that could skewer enemies long before they got close enough to use their own shorter weapons. The psychological impact was immense. Imagine facing a solid wall of armoured men, shields locked, with 5 rows of razor-sharp pike points protruding towards you. Facing this legendary formation was Flamininus, with a roughly equal force numerically, but radically different in composition and tactical doctrine. His army totalled approximately 26,000 men and represented a true coalition force. The core was 20,000 Roman legionaries and Italian allies, the backbone of Roman military power. These were supported by 6,000 Aetolian light infantry, fierce Greek warriors who fought for the freedom of their cities. He also had 2,000 Cretan, Athamenan, and Apolloniatan light troops, famous throughout the Mediterranean for their skills with javelin and sling. His cavalry, about 2,400 strong, was a mix of 1,400 Roman and Italian horsemen and 1,000 Aetolian cavalry. The army was a polyglot force, but it was united by Roman discipline and Flamininus's leadership. The Roman legion was a revolutionary military system, completely different in philosophy from the Macedonian phalanx. Rather than fighting as a single massive block, the legion was organized into small flexible units called maniples, each consisting of about 120 men. These maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern with gaps between them, allowing for extraordinary flexibility on the battlefield. If one maniple was pushed back or needed support, those behind it could advance through the gaps. If the terrain was broken or uneven, each maniple could adjust its position independently. This tactical flexibility made the legion adaptable to almost any battlefield condition. The legionaries themselves were armed and trained for a completely different style of warfare than the phalangites. Each Roman soldier carried a large rectangular shield, the scutum, which could protect him from neck to knee. He wore armour, usually chainmail for the wealthier soldiers, and a sturdy helmet. But his primary weapons were the gladius, a short, brutally effective stabbing sword perfect for close combat, and 2 pila, heavy javelins designed to be thrown just before contact. The pilum was an ingenious weapon. Its long iron shank was designed to bend on impact, making it impossible for the enemy to throw back and weighing down their shields if it stuck. The fundamental difference in these two systems came down to a simple tactical question. Would the battle be fought at pike length or sword length? If the phalanx could keep its formation intact and hold the Romans at bay with their 18-foot sarissas, they would win. The legionaries would be skewered before they could close to use their swords. But if the terrain was broken, if gaps opened in the phalanx formation, if the Romans could somehow get past those deadly pike points, then the superior mobility and close combat capability of the legionaries would prove decisive. It was the ultimate test of rigid power versus flexible adaptation. As spring arrived in 197 BC, Both armies were operating in the region of Thessaly, manoeuvring through the rolling, hilly countryside as each commander sought favourable ground for the inevitable battle. Neither Flamininus nor Philip wanted to fight at a disadvantage, so they moved cautiously through the region around the city of Scotusa, their scouts ranging far ahead, probing for the enemy position. Both armies were advancing along the Cynoscephalae hills, a name that means dog's heads, in Greek referring to the peculiar shape of the ridgeline. The terrain was far from ideal for either army. The hills were covered with scattered rocks, brush and uneven ground. It was terrible terrain for the phalanx, which needed flat, open ground to deploy effectively. But it was also challenging for the Romans, whose advantage in flexibility would be tested. On the night of June 7th, a fierce storm erupted over the hills, one of those violent Mediterranean tempests that turns day into night. The rain lashed down, turning the paths to mud and making visibility almost zero. By dawn on June 8th, the rain had stopped, but it had been replaced by something even worse for military operations, a thick, impenetrable fog that clung to the hillsides like a shroud. Neither army could see more than a few yards in any direction. Both commanders, professional soldiers who understood the catastrophic dangers of stumbling into battle blind, ordered their men to make camp and wait for the fog to lift. But they both made one critical decision that would trigger the battle neither had planned. Around 6 a.m., as his army settled into its encampment, Philip sent out a screening force to secure the high ground and gain better visibility once the fog cleared. He dispatched 800 light infantry and 50 cavalry to occupy the hilltops. It was a routine, sensible precaution. Almost simultaneously, Flamininus made the same decision. He sent his own screening force of light infantry and cavalry up into the fog-shrouded hills to secure the heights and scout for the enemy. Neither commander knew that he has just set in motion a chain of events that would lead to one of the most famous battles in military history. Around 7 a.m., as the first rays of sunlight began to thin the fog but visibility remained poor, the two screening forces literally stumbled into each other on the ridge. The meeting was completely unexpected, a chance encounter in the mist. For a moment, both sides must have stood frozen in shock, straining to see through the fog, trying to determine if these shadowy figures were friend or foe. Then recognition dawned, and chaos erupted. The initial skirmish was fierce but confused, a swirling melee of light troops fighting in the murk. The Macedonians, with superior numbers in their screening force, quickly gained the upper hand. The Roman light infantry, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered and fighting uphill in the fog, began to give ground. What started as a measured withdrawal quickly turned into something more desperate. The Romans were being driven down the reverse slope of the ridge, their formation beginning to fragment under the pressure of the Macedonian pursuit. Word of the clash reached both commanders almost simultaneously. Philip, in his camp on one side of the ridge, received reports that his scouts had encountered enemy forces and were pushing them back. Flamininus, on the other side, got the more alarming news that his screening force was engaged and being driven back by superior numbers. Both commanders faced a critical decision. This was not the battle either had planned. The terrain was terrible, visibility was still poor, and neither army was properly deployed for a major engagement. The cautious choice, the safe choice, would be to recall the screening forces, disengage, and wait for better conditions. But Philip saw an opportunity. His light troops were winning, the enemy was in retreat, and his confidence in the invincibility of his phalanx was absolute. If he could quickly reinforce his screening force and push the Romans off the ridge entirely, he could seize the high ground and force Flamininus to either attack uphill or retreat. It was a gamble, but Philip was a warrior king who had spent his entire adult life campaigning. He made his decision in seconds. The king dispatched an immediate reinforcement under his officer Athenagoras, 500 mercenary heavy infantry, 2,000 peltasts, and critically, 500 heavy cavalry, Macedonians, Thessalians, southern Greeks, and Illyrians. This was a substantial force, nearly a quarter of his available troops, and it represented a major escalation. The commitment of the heavy cavalry in particular signaled that this was no longer a skirmish, it was becoming a battle. Athenagoras led his reinforcements up the fog-shrouded hillside in a rapid, aggressive advance. Around 7:15 a.m., as the fog was finally beginning to lift, these fresh troops burst through the thinning mist and crashed into the flanks of the Roman screening force. The psychological impact was immediate. The Romans, already under pressure and fighting uphill, suddenly found themselves facing not just light infantry, but heavily armoured mercenaries and cavalry. The situation went from difficult to desperate in moments. The Roman light infantry began a full retreat, not routed but certainly badly shaken, careening back down the reverse slope of the hill towards their own camp. The Macedonian cavalry, sensing victory, spurred after them in hot pursuit. It would have turned into a massacre, a complete destruction of the Roman screening force, if not for the timely intervention of the Aetolian cavalry. These Greek horsemen, Rome's allies, saw the crisis developing and charged into the pursuing Macedonians, crashing into their flank and stopping their momentum cold. The pursuit ground to a halt, and the battle transformed from a mobile chase into a stationary, grinding fight near the base of the Roman camp. Flamininus, watching this unfold, understood immediately that he was losing control of the situation. If he allowed the Macedonians to maintain the high ground and continue to reinforce, his entire army could be pinned against their camp and destroyed piecemeal. He had to commit. With the decisiveness that had made him one of Rome's finest commanders, he ordered his main force forward. His right wing, which was closer and more readily deployable, began advancing up the slopes of Cynoscephalae to meet the Macedonians. The Roman light infantry, bloodied but still organized, reformed and joined the advance. The Romans were now fully committed to battle. Around 7:45 a.m., Philip himself arrived at the hilltops with his ultimate weapon, the Phalanx. 10,000 heavy infantrymen, the core of his army, marched up the slopes in their disciplined ranks. These were the heirs of Alexander, the successors to the men who had conquered Persia, and they carried themselves with the confidence of an unbroken tradition of victory. Philip quickly assessed the situation. His screening force and reinforcements had driven the Romans back, but the battle was now escalating. The Roman main force was advancing uphill towards his position. The Macedonian king faced a critical choice. His entire army was not yet assembled. His left wing was still forming up and not ready for battle. His phalanx could not deploy properly on the uneven, broken ground of the hilltops. Every military instinct, every tactical principle taught to him by his generals, would have screamed that he should wait, consolidate his position, get his left wing into formation, and force the enemy to come to him uphill on ground he had prepared. But Philip was also a man of action, a king who had led from the front his entire life, and the momentum was with him. His men had been winning since the first contact. The Romans were advancing uphill, which meant they would be tired and disorganized when they reached his position. If he struck now, hard and fast, he could shatter the Roman right wing before their full army deployed. The psychological pull of momentum, the warrior's instinct to press an advantage, and perhaps a touch of overconfidence in his legendary phalanx overcame his tactical caution. He made his decision. Philip ordered his phalanx to form up immediately, right there on the broken hillside. He didn't wait for perfect conditions or ideal ground. He ordered his 10,000 phalangites to line up in a depth of 16 shields, the standard formation, slightly deeper than normal to provide extra weight for the downhill charge. The veterans moved with practiced efficiency, shields locking, sarissas being lowered from their vertical resting position to the horizontal attack position. It was an awe-inspiring sight, even on broken ground. A wall of bronze and iron, bristling with thousands of 18-foot pike points. Then Philip, at the front of his men as a Macedonian king should be, gave the order that would seal the fate of the battle: fall upon the Romans. The right wing of the Macedonian phalanx surged forward downhill. The ground shook under the tramp of 10,000 feet. The sarissas levelled forward, creating that terrifying forest of steel that had broken countless armies. They were charging downhill, which gave them additional momentum and impact. The Roman soldiers climbing uphill towards them must have felt their courage waver as they saw that wall of spears descending upon them like an avalanche of bronze. This was the phalanx in its most devastating form, a mobile fortress of death, and it was coming down the slope at them with all the weight and power of a falling mountain. The collision was catastrophic for the Romans. The Macedonian phalanx, with gravity and momentum behind it, crashed into the Roman right wing like a tsunami hitting a seawall. The Roman maniples, designed for flexibility, but still fundamentally infantry with shorter weapons, simply could not withstand the combined pressure of the downhill charge and those 18-foot pikes. The front ranks of Romans were impaled on the sarissas before they could even get close enough to use their swords. Men who tried to close with the phalanx found themselves skewered 3 or 4 ranks deep. The Roman right wing began to buckle, then break. Soldiers started falling back down the hill, a retreat that threatened to turn into a rout at any moment. The Macedonian phalanx, sensing victory, pressed forward relentlessly, maintaining its formation and grinding forward step by inexorable step. Philip's gamble seemed to be paying off magnificently. His right wing was winning decisively. The Romans were being driven back towards their camp. If this continued, the entire Roman army could collapse. Flamininus, watching from his vantage point, must have felt a spike of genuine fear. His right wing was being destroyed by the legendary phalanx, just as countless armies before him had been destroyed. But he was not a man who panicked. He had a plan, and more importantly, he had his left wing still intact and ready. While Philip's right wing phalanx was descending the hills in triumph, the Macedonian left wing was still struggling to deploy on the broken ground at the top of the ridge. This was Flamininus's opportunity. While the Macedonian right wing was achieving a devastating victory, the situation on the Macedonian left was drastically different. This is where the inherent weaknesses of the phalanx and Philip's hasty decision to give battle before his entire army was ready would prove fatal. The Macedonian left wing, still forming up on the rough broken terrain at the summit of the ridge, was simply not ready for battle. The phalanx was a formation that required time, space, and flat ground to deploy effectively. The men needed to align their ranks perfectly, lock their shields, adjust the positioning of their sarissas, and establish the internal cohesion that made the formation deadly. On the uneven, rocky ground of the Cynoscephalae ridge, with its scattered boulders, brush, and slopes, this was proving nearly impossible. Gaps were opening in the formation. Some units were advancing faster than others. The neat, aligned rows that were essential to the phalanx's effectiveness were fragmenting. Flamininus saw this chaos and recognized it for the opportunity it was. While his right wing was being driven back by the unstoppable Macedonian right, his own left wing, the Roman maniples that had been held in reserve, was fresh, fully deployed, and facing a disorganized enemy. This was the moment. The Roman commander gave the order, and his left wing surged forward up the slopes to engage the struggling Macedonian left. The contrast between the two sides of the battle could not have been more stark. On the Roman right, disciplined legionaries were being systematically destroyed by a perfectly functioning phalanx charging downhill. On the Roman left, those same legionaries were advancing uphill against a phalanx that couldn't properly form up and was fighting at a massive disadvantage. The battle had split into two separate engagements, each with its own dynamic, each seemingly heading to opposite conclusions. The Roman left crashed into the Macedonian left, and the superior flexibility of the legion immediately began to tell. The Macedonians, unable to maintain their tight formation on the broken ground, found their greatest strength, the massed pike points, neutralized. Gaps in their line became avenues of attack. Roman legionaries trained to fight as individuals and in small groups poured through these gaps. Once they got inside the reach of those 18-foot sarissas, the phalangites were at a fatal disadvantage. The Macedonian pikes, so deadly at long range, became unwieldy liabilities in close combat. A phalangite couldn't effectively swing or maneuver an 18-foot weapon once an enemy was within a few feet. The Romans, with their large shields and short stabbing swords, were perfectly equipped for this kind of brutal, intimate combat. The gladius, that short Roman sword, was designed for one purpose: to stab into the torso a quick, economical killing stroke. In the press of bodies, the Romans began to methodically butcher the Macedonians. The Macedonian left wing began to give ground, falling back in increasing disorder. Their formation, already compromised by the terrain, was now actively breaking apart under Roman pressure. Soldiers in the front ranks, seeing comrades being cut down, tried to back up, pushing into the ranks behind them. The neat rows dissolved into a disorganized mob. This was the phalanx's nightmare scenario, losing its cohesion in close combat against a more flexible enemy. The Macedonian left wing was being destroyed. Both sides of the battle had now reached decisive moments. Philip's right wing was triumphant, driving the Romans back towards their camp. Flamininus's left wing was equally triumphant, shattering the Macedonian left and pushing them back in disorder. The two wings had essentially passed each other, moving in opposite directions. This created a situation that was rare in ancient warfare. Both armies had their rear areas exposed to potential enemy attack. It was at this moment that the true genius of Roman tactical flexibility would prove decisive. In the chaos and dust of the battle, with victory and defeat hanging in balance, an unnamed Roman tribune, a junior officer whose name has been lost to history but whose actions would determine the fate of empires, looked across the ridge and had a moment of brilliant tactical insight. Military historians would study this moment for centuries. This unknown officer commanded approximately 20 maniples from the rear ranks of the victorious Roman left wing, about 2,400 men. His wing had pushed the Macedonian left up and over the ridge, and he found himself behind the main battle line with his troops relatively intact and uncommitted. As he crested the ridge, he could see the entire battlefield spread before him. To his right, he could see the Macedonian right wing still pushing forward in their seemingly unstoppable advance, driving his fellow Romans back. Most critically, he could see something that would have been invisible from any other vantage point. The rear of the triumphant Macedonian Phalanx was completely exposed to him. The Phalanx was designed to fight in one direction, forward. Its entire tactical doctrine was built around presenting an impenetrable front to the enemy, but that meant its rear was essentially undefended. The Phalangites wore their armour on their fronts and carried their shields forward. Their backs were vulnerable, and they were locked in place by their own formation. The men in the rear ranks couldn't turn around without creating chaos in the front ranks. They were committed, focused entirely on the enemy in front of them, grinding forward to complete their victory. This Roman tribune made a decision that demonstrated the core advantage of Roman tactical doctrine. Without waiting for orders from Flamininus, without asking permission or consulting the chain of command, he exercised the initiative that Roman officers were trained to use. He immediately turned his 20 maniples, about a third of the Roman left wing, and led them at a run across the ridge. His target was not an enemy to his front, but the flank and rear of the Macedonian right wing on the other side of the battlefield. The flexibility of the manipular system made this maneuver possible. Those 20 maniples could detach from their wing, move independently across broken ground, reorient themselves, and attack in a completely new direction without losing cohesion. A phalanx could never have done this. The phalanx was a single, unified mass that moved as one giant block. It couldn't split apart, redirect, and recombine without dissolving its entire formation. But the Roman legion, built on small independent units, could adapt to any situation. The 2,400 Roman legionaries came down off the ridge like an avalanche, screaming their war cries, and crashed into the rear and flank of the unsuspecting Macedonian phalanx. The impact was catastrophic. The Macedonians, locked in their formation and focused entirely on the enemy in front of them, never saw it coming. Suddenly, men in the rear ranks were being cut down by attackers from behind and the side. Panic, raw and infectious, began to spread through the phalanx. The phalangites in the rear ranks tried to turn to face this new threat, but turning in place while maintaining a formation of 18-foot pikes proved impossible. Sarissas crashed into each other, tangling. Men tripped over their own weapons. The tight formation that gave the phalanx its strength became a death trap. Soldiers couldn't move, couldn't properly defend themselves, couldn't even see where the attacks were coming from. The Romans, fighting with their short swords in the press of bodies, were in their element. The discipline and cohesion of the Macedonian right wing began to break down. The rear ranks, being slaughtered and unable to effectively fight back, broke and ran. This panic spread forward through the formation like a poison. Even the front ranks, who had been winning their fight just moments before, felt the collapse behind them. Suddenly, instead of being part of an unstoppable, unified war machine, each phalangite was just an individual man, surrounded by chaos, wondering if he should stay and die or run, and perhaps live. The Macedonian Phalanx, Philip's pride, the legendary formation that had conquered the Persian Empire, began to disintegrate. Soldiers started throwing down their heavy shields and cumbersome sarissas, weapons that made running impossible. In Macedonian military tradition, dropping your sarissa was a sign of surrender, a plea for mercy. The soldiers believed that if they threw down their weapons and raised their hands, the Romans would accept their surrender and take them prisoner. But the Romans, in the heat of battle and the fog of war, didn't understand or recognize this gesture. To them, these were still enemies in the middle of a battlefield. The legionaries kept coming, kept stabbing with their gladi, kept killing. The Macedonians, having surrendered in their own military tradition, stood confused and defenseless as the Romans cut them down where they stood. It was a brutal, horrible misunderstanding born of cultural differences, and it turned the rout into a massacre. Philip V, watching his invincible phalanx collapse into chaos and slaughter, made the hardest decision of his life. There would be no miraculous recovery, no heroic last stand. The battle was lost. His army was being destroyed. If he stayed, he would be captured or killed, and Macedon would lose not just its army but its king. With a handful of loyal guards, Philip turned his horse and fled the battlefield. His survival was necessary for the survival of his kingdom, but it also meant abandoning thousands of his soldiers to their fate. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a slaughter. The Macedonian army, no longer an organized fighting force, fragmented into thousands of individual soldiers running for their lives across the hills of Thessaly. The Roman and Greek cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down the fleeing men. The blood-soaked fields of Cynoscephalae became a killing ground. When the butchery finally ended and the exhausted Romans began counting the cost, the numbers told the story of a complete and utter catastrophe for Macedon. 8,000 Macedonian soldiers lay dead on the field, their bodies scattered across the hillsides where the proud phalanx had been destroyed. Another 5,000 had been taken prisoner, many of them wounded, all of them destined for slavery or ransom. Philip's army, the military might that had made Macedon a great power, had been shattered. The Roman casualties, by comparison, were remarkably light, approximately 700 killed. The disparity in losses speaks to the completeness of the tactical victory. Once the phalanx formation broke, it became a one-sided massacre. The Macedonians, trained to fight only in their tight formation with their long pikes, were helpless as individuals against the Romans, who were trained for close-quarter combat and retained their discipline even in the chaos of pursuit. Philip fled north to Macedon with the scattered remnants of his army, perhaps 2,000 men who had managed to escape the carnage. His military power was broken, his prestige shattered, and his options exhausted. Flamininus, methodical and thorough in victory, pursued him into Macedon, giving him no time to reorganize or recruit a new army. Within weeks, Philip was forced to send envoys to negotiate for peace. He had no choice. He no longer had an army capable of defending his kingdom. The peace terms were harsh, but not as devastating as they might have been. The Romans, interestingly, did not seek to destroy Macedon entirely or depose Philip. They had their own strategic calculations. A weakened Macedon could serve as a buffer state against other powers in the region, particularly the Seleucid Empire. Philip was forced to surrender his entire navy except for his flagship, a huge blow to his ability to project power. He had to pay a massive war indemnity of 1,000 talents, half immediately and the rest in annual installments over 10 years, a crushing financial burden. His army was limited to just 5,000 men, could not include any war elephants, and could not be led beyond Macedon's borders without explicit permission from the Roman Senate. Most importantly, Philip had to withdraw all his garrisons from every Greek city in Europe and Asia. The fetters of Greece, Demetrius, Chalcis, and Corinth, the strategic cities that controlled access to Greece, were taken from Macedonian control. The Greek cities were declared free and autonomous, though this freedom was, ironically, now guaranteed by Roman power rather than by any Greek agency. Philip V, who had once dreamed of expanding his empire, was now confined to his kingdom, his power broken, his ambitions crushed. In 196 BC, at the Isthmian Games near Corinth, Flamininus made a dramatic public announcement that would echo throughout the Greek world. Before a massive crowd gathered for the games, a herald proclaimed that the Roman Senate and Flamininus declared all Greek cities free, independent, and subject to their own laws, without garrisons and without tribute. The crowd erupted in such thunderous applause that, according to the ancient sources, birds flying overhead fell dead from the sheer volume of noise. It was a brilliant piece of propaganda, positioning Rome as the liberator of Greece. The reality, of course, was more complex. The Greeks were free in the sense that they no longer answered to Philip, but they now lived under Roman protection, which was a polite term for Roman oversight. Within a generation, Greece would be firmly under Roman control, but for the moment, Flamininus had achieved a masterpiece of diplomacy to match his tactical victory. Rome had destroyed its enemy while being celebrated as a liberator. The Battle of Cynoscephalae marked a pivotal moment in military history, the day the Macedonian Phalanx, the tactical system that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for over a century, was definitively proven inferior to the Roman legion. The battle became a textbook example that would be studied for centuries of how tactical flexibility and adaptability triumph over rigid formations, regardless of those formations' fearsome reputation. The phalanx had been the apex predator of ancient warfare since Philip V of Macedon had perfected it, and Alexander the Great had used it to conquer the known world. It was designed for set-piece battles on flat, open terrain, where its overwhelming frontal power could be brought to bear. In those ideal conditions, it was virtually unbeatable, but Cynoscephalae exposed its fundamental weaknesses with brutal clarity. The phalanx required extensive preparation time to deploy properly. It needed flat, unobstructed ground to maintain the tight formation essential to its effectiveness. It could really only fight in one direction, forward. It was slow to maneuver and almost impossible to reorient once committed, and once the formation broke, whether from rough terrain, enemy action, or simple chance, the individual phalangites were vulnerable and poorly equipped for close combat. Their long sarissas, so deadly at pike length, became useless encumbrances at sword length. The Roman legion, by contrast, had been designed specifically to address these limitations. Built on small independent maniples rather than a single massive block, it could adapt to any terrain. It could fight on hills, in forests, in urban areas, anywhere. If one maniple was destroyed or pushed back, others could move forward to fill the gap. If the formation broke, the legionaries were trained to fight effectively as individuals or in small groups. The legion was a flexible, adaptive weapon system that could handle any battlefield condition. The unnamed Roman tribune who led those 20 maniples around the ridge to attack the rear of the Macedonian phalanx had demonstrated this flexibility in its most dramatic form. He had taken a third of his wing, moved it independently across broken ground, reoriented it 90 degrees, and attacked an entirely different target, all without orders, all on his own initiative. This kind of maneuver was simply impossible for a phalanx. It required a tactical system that trusted junior officers to use their judgment, that organized troops into small independent units, and that trained soldiers to fight in any direction and any formation. The lesson of Cynoscephalae would be confirmed again and again in subsequent battles. At Pydna in 168 BC, another Roman army would destroy another Macedonian phalanx using similar tactics, forcing the phalanx onto broken ground, opening gaps in the formation, and exploiting those gaps with the flexibility of the legions. The age of the phalanx was over. The age of the legion had begun. Cynoscephalae was more than just a tactical victory. It was a strategic earthquake that reshaped the entire balance of power in the Mediterranean world. The battle marked the moment when Rome, already dominant in the Western Mediterranean after defeating Carthage, announced itself as the new superpower in the East as well. Before Cynoscephalae, Macedon had been one of the great powers, one of the successor kingdoms to Alexander's empire that had divided the Hellenistic world among them. After Cynoscephalae, Macedon was a defeated client state, confined to its borders, its military power broken, and its king subordinate to Roman authority. The psychological impact of this defeat reverberated throughout the Hellenistic world. If Rome could so decisively defeat the heir of Alexander, what chance did any other power have? Greece, for which the war had theoretically been fought, found itself in an ambiguous position. The cities were free, but it was a freedom guaranteed and therefore controlled by Rome. The Greek leagues and city-states would quickly discover that Roman liberation meant Roman expectation of loyalty and cooperation. Within 50 years, Greece would be directly incorporated into the Roman Empire as the province of Achaia. The liberation proclaimed by Flamininus at the Isthmian Games was real in the moment, but temporary in the long term. The defeat of Philip also set in motion the events that would lead to Rome's next major conflict in the East. The Seleucid king Antiochus III, who had been Philip's ally in their secret pact to carve up smaller kingdoms, watched the destruction of the Macedonian army with alarm. He began his own expansion into Asia Minor and Greece, which would lead directly to the Roman-Seleucid War beginning in 192 BC. Rome would defeat Antiochus as well, extending Roman power even further east. The Second Macedonian War and Cynoscephalae established a pattern that would repeat throughout the next century. Rome would be drawn into the affairs of the Eastern Mediterranean, initially as a protector or arbiter, then as an active participant, and finally as a conqueror. Each war created the conditions for the next war. Each victory expanded Roman influence and Roman responsibilities, until eventually Rome found itself master of the entire Mediterranean basin. Cynoscephalae was a key link in that chain of conquest. Beyond the strategic and tactical significance, it's worth remembering that Cynoscephalae was a human tragedy, particularly for the Macedonians. 8,000 men died on that hillside and another 5,000 were taken prisoner, most of whom would be sold into slavery. These were not professional soldiers fighting for pay. Many were citizens of Macedon, farmers and craftsmen called up for military service to defend their kingdom. They died far from home on a fog-shrouded hill because of decisions made by kings and consuls who survived the battle. The horrible misunderstanding in the final moments of the battle, when Macedonian soldiers dropped their sarissas in surrender, according to their military tradition, but the Romans didn't recognize this gesture and kept killing, adds a particularly tragic note. These men believed they were being taken prisoner, not executed. They stood defenseless, hands raised, and were cut down where they stood. It was a brutal reminder that in the chaos and fury of ancient warfare, cultural misunderstandings could be as deadly as any weapon. For Philip V himself, the battle was a personal and political disaster. He survived and remained king, but he spent the rest of his reign as a subordinate to Rome, required to seek Roman permission for military action, forced to watch as his kingdom's power and prestige were systematically dismantled. He died in 179 BC, 22 years after Cynoscephalae, having never recovered the glory of his earlier reign. His son Perseus would later attempt to restore Macedonian power, leading to the Third Macedonian War, which would end even more disastrously, with Macedon being completely dissolved as a kingdom and absorbed into the Roman Empire. For Flamininus, by contrast, Cynoscephalae was the defining triumph of his career. He returned to Rome as a conquering hero, was granted a triumph, the highest military honor Rome could bestow, and became one of the most celebrated figures of his generation. His reputation as both a capable general and a skilled diplomat served Rome well in subsequent Eastern campaigns. He had proven that Rome could defeat the legendary armies of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and he had done so while maintaining the moral high ground of Greek liberation. We're about to explore the lasting legacy of this battle that changed ancient warfare forever. But first, if you're finding this deep dive into one of history's most important tactical innovations as fascinating as I am, show your support by hitting that like button. It really helps us continue bringing you these detailed historical stories. The Battle of Cynoscephalae stands as one of the most significant tactical engagements in ancient military history, a pivotal moment when the warfare of the past gave way to the warfare of the future. The lessons learned on those fog-shrouded hills in 197 BC would influence military thinking for centuries to come. The battle demonstrated with brutal clarity that rigid, specialized formations like the Phalanx, no matter how powerful in ideal conditions, were inferior to flexible, adaptive systems like the Roman legion that could handle any terrain and any situation. This lesson transcended the specific details of pikes versus swords. At its core, Cynoscephalae taught that military organizations need to balance specialization with adaptability, centralized control with initiative at lower levels, and standardized doctrine with flexibility to handle the unexpected. These are lessons that remain relevant to military planners to this day. Modern military theorists still study Cynoscephalae as an example of how organizational flexibility and the empowerment of junior leaders to make independent decisions can overcome numerical or technological advantages. The unnamed Roman tribune who led those 20 maniples around the ridge without waiting for orders is held up as an exemplar of the kind of initiative-taking that effective military organizations need to encourage. The battle also marked the beginning of Rome's transformation from a regional Italian power to a Mediterranean superpower and eventually a world empire. Before Cynoscephalae, Rome was known primarily for its wars with Carthage. After Cynoscephalae, Rome was recognized as the dominant military power in the Mediterranean, capable of projecting force into the Greek world and defeating the legendary armies descended from Alexander's conquests. The road from Cynoscephalae led to Pydna, to the conquest of Greece, to the destruction of Carthage and Corinth in 146 BC, to Caesar's conquests in Gaul, and ultimately to the creation of an empire that would dominate Europe and the Mediterranean for half a millennium. For the Greek world, Cynoscephalae marked the end of true independence and the beginning of Roman domination, however benevolent it might have seemed at first. The freedom proclaimed by Flamininus was real in a limited sense. The Greek cities were no longer subject to Macedonian garrisons, but they had simply exchanged one overlord for another, more powerful one. Within 2 generations, Greece would be a Roman province, its cities subject to Roman governors, its young men serving in Roman armies, its wealth flowing to Rome. The tactical legacy of the battle influenced Roman military doctrine for centuries. The flexibility and adaptability that had proven decisive at Cynoscephalae were baked into Roman military training and organization. Roman commanders studied the battle and internalized its lessons about the importance of terrain, the value of junior officer initiative, and the superiority of flexible formations over rigid ones. These lessons served Rome well in countless subsequent battles. The Battle of Cynoscephalae was a clash born of fog, chance, and the unexpected collision of 2 armies that had stumbled into each other almost by accident. But from that chaotic, unplanned encounter emerged a battle that would reshape the ancient world and establish principles of warfare that remain relevant 2,000 years later. It was the day the legendary Macedonian Phalanx, the formation that had conquered an empire, met its match in the flexible, adaptive Roman legion. On those uneven hillsides in Thessaly, Philip V learned the hard lesson that reputation and tradition are not enough when facing an enemy that can adapt faster and fight smarter. His decision to give battle before his army was fully deployed on terrain unsuited to his tactics against an enemy whose tactical system was specifically designed to exploit the phalanx's weaknesses proved catastrophic. 8,000 of his soldiers paid for that decision with their lives. Flamininus's victory was built on more than just superior tactics. It was built on a military system that trusted junior officers to make decisions, that organized troops into flexible units that could adapt to any situation, and that trained soldiers to fight effectively whether in formation or as individuals. The unnamed tribune who led those 20 maniples in the decisive flanking attack embodied these principles. He saw an opportunity. He took independent action without waiting for orders, and he changed the course of the battle and history. The battle marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age when Macedon and the other Hellenistic kingdoms dominated the eastern Mediterranean was over. The age of Roman hegemony had begun. Within a century of Cynoscephalae, Rome would control virtually the entire Mediterranean basin, from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Egypt. The road to that empire was paved with many battles, but Cynoscephalae was among the most decisive. The moment when Rome proved it could defeat the greatest military traditions of the Greek world on the field of battle. For students of military history, Cynoscephalae remains a masterclass in the importance of tactical flexibility, terrain, and leadership initiative. It demonstrates that victory in battle comes not just from having the best weapons or the bravest soldiers, but from having a military system that can adapt to the unexpected, exploit opportunities as they arise, and make good decisions at every level of command. These are timeless lessons that apply to military operations in any age. What do you think about the decisive moment of the battle? That unnamed Roman tribune's decision to wheel his maniples around and attack the rear of the Macedonian Phalanx. Was this brilliant initiative that should be encouraged in military leaders, or was it a risky move that just happened to work? Should he have waited for orders, or was he right to seize the moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this detailed exploration of one of history's most tactically significant battles has fascinated you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth military history. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next video, where we'll continue to bring the greatest battles and most pivotal moments from history to life. Share this video with anyone who loves military history or wants to understand how the Roman Empire rose to dominance. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one where the clash of empires continues.